Today we're gonna take a look at one of my favorite rogue builds in Diablo 4 that simply breezes through the leveling stages and comes with some of the highest damage. This build is extremely agile, very fun to play, and surprisingly requires a minimal investment to make it work as early as level 25. Now this build is primarily melee, focusing on abilities like Twisting Blades and Shadow Imbuement for maximum damage, maximum AoE, Shadow Step and Dash to constantly zoom around the map and get even more crit damage and stuns, plus multiple energy regen mechanics, including infinite energy via the inner sight, level 20 specialization. Now skill-wise, here's how the build looks like. For the basic skill, I actually went with the puncture, unlike some of the others. This isn't a melee skill, but actually something that hits enemies from medium range, so if they get too far away from you, this still works against them. It also has some really amazing mechanics baked right into it. One of them is the fact that it slows enemies on every third cast or every time that you perform a critical hit, which basically counts as crowd control, and as you will soon come to find, there are other abilities and passives that will benefit from that. You will obviously also want to go for the fundamental puncture final upgrade. This now makes it possible to throw 3 at the same time with this skill, and if you hit an enemy with at least 2 of those blades, and let's be honest, that's gonna be all the time, you will apply a vulnerability debuff, which is exactly what you want. Now, in terms of the core skills, obviously the bread and butter here is going to be the Twisting Blades. This is going to be the main damage dealer, one of the best abilities actually in Diablo 4. With minimal setup, this is already amazing. Especially on the return, this is when it's going to deal the highest amount of damage. We went with the enhanced Twisting Blade so that we can further increase that return damage, and in my case, I opted for the advanced Twisting Blades because I really like the cooldown reduction on all my active abilities. As you'll soon come to find, this build lets us completely spam everything. The next 2 abilities are going to be Shadow Step and Dash. This is what makes us just zoom all around the map, jump from one enemy to another, and what makes the rogue so versatile and so fast. You can just reach destinations much easier, which means faster leveling. In both of the enhanced versions of these abilities, we get extra crits. So in the case of the Dash, we get extra crit damage, 20% against affected targets. Meanwhile, for the enhanced Shadow Step, we get extra crit chance, 8% for 3 seconds. But in the case of the Shadow Step, I also went with a methodical upgrade because this lets us now stun enemies for 2 seconds. I found this to be an amazing thing to have, especially since it also works on elites, so I wanted to always interrupt them one way or another. This gives us just that. And not only does it work with this, but it also works with our capstone passive called Momentum, which is what we're gonna choose with this build eventually once we reach at least level like 35, because this provides us with a momentum buff every time we hit a stunned, dazed, or frozen enemy, or when we hit an enemy from behind, which is essentially exactly what Shadow Step does all the time. So we always get these buffs for increased damage reduction, increased energy regeneration, and a lot more movement speed. You can obviously pick the other upgrade for the Shadow Step if you want to have it even less often on cooldown, but personally I did not find that to be needed because my Twisting Blade setup was already reducing my cooldowns all the time, plenty enough so that I could already spam my Shadow Step anyway, but a stun came in even more in handy. This also brings us to the Poison Trap, and this actually has a very good synergy with this build. Not only does this deal incredible damage, but if you go with the enhanced version, it actually knocks enemies back. And yes, that absolutely works on elites too. Between this and the stun from the Shadow Step, you can just chain stun entire groups of elites and they would never be able to even hit you back. This is how I countered them without relying on any defensive capabilities. You can also go with the countering Poison Trap, by the way, which has a 30% chance to reset your imbuement skill cooldown, which works really well if you're also adding the Shadow Imbuement, which you definitely will with this build. In fact, you can definitely run with Shadow Imbuement and Poison Trap and kinda get both of these elemental effects at the same time. However, later on, once you get access to the ultimate, especially something like the Shadow Clone, you're probably gonna want to drop this and grab that instead, since it gives you a lot more damage and it's a bit more useful later on. And this also brings us to the Shadow Imbuement. Of course, this is one of the other main abilities that we're using with this build. It's going to deal extremely great AoE damage, especially coupled with the Twisting Blades. It's the perfect synergy between these. I only went with the enhanced version because I needed the extra 15% critical strike. For now, it's plenty enough. The more important ones are going to be these two right here, the Shadow Crash, and more important, the Consuming Shadows, because each time we defeat an enemy with the shadow damage, it's going to generate for us 30 additional energy. This is a very resource intensive build, so we're gonna have a lot of ways to generate energy and basically keep rolling with Twisting Blades attacks imbued by the shadow damage. In terms of the ultimate ability, in my case I went with the Shadow Clone, but Death Trap can also work really well. It's just that because I'm so mobile with this build, I preferred a Shadow Clone that mimics and moves alongside me. And if you go with the full upgrade, you can make it deal up to 80% of your damage, so it's almost like doubling your damage for free. Plus, it's one of the few abilities here to provide us with an unstoppable buff to become immune to any crowd control mechanics, and trust me, there's gonna be many of them, as later on enemies tend to stun all the time, and rogues barely have any unstoppable mechanics. As far as some of the other passives go, I went with a couple of points into Sturdy so we can get some extra close range damage reduction, plus we have the Siphoning Strikes, which kind of acts almost like a lifesteal. We gain 3% of our maximum HP back as health on anytime we do critical strikes, so we're gonna do that all the time, and this is gonna heal up really nicely. Now, there are a few passives in here that are very strong. Weapon Mastery is one of them, especially if you couple this with swords. It gives you a lower but more consistent 9% increased damage, rather than the 15 for the daggers that only works if the enemy is healthy, which means over 80% HP. We also have the Precision Imbuement, which gives a critical chance to all imbue skills, and since we have Shadow Imbuement almost always activated, we gain that almost all the time. And finally, these two down the tree, Adrenaline Rush for even more resource regeneration, 15% increase as we keep moving, which we will constantly. And finally, the Haste, a more interesting one because if you're above 50% max energy, it gives you a 15% increase in movement speed, while below 50% max energy, you gain a 15 increase attack speed instead. I think that is actually pretty nice. Now, in terms of the aspects, as I've said, to make this build truly shine even early on, you only need like 3 of them at max, and you already find them at around level 25 in Skull's Glen if you complete a couple of the missions over there. Specifically, in Jalal's Vigil, you can find the Blade Dancer's aspect, and then in Old Stones, you can go ahead not too far off and grab the Edge Master aspect. So the Blade Dancer is what makes Twisted Blade so OP, as now the return makes the blades circle around you for a short duration, dealing extra damage, plus the orbit damage increases based on the distance that the blades travel. And given how we constantly zoom around the map, this is going to make them travel very far, so we're almost always getting the max buff. And by the way, speaking of max buffs, I recommend putting these on a two-hander, in this case bow or crossbow, to benefit from the 100% increase of the two-handed bonus. So now it deals a max damage of 40% instead of just 20. You can then just keep the bow until like level 50, even if it's a low level one, because your main source of damage are the swords or the knives, and only those you will want to change often and keep as rares, but not the rest. The Edge Master aspect is also great. This can be placed on an amulet if you want to give it a slightly higher skill increase by 50%, so now it's a 15% increase in damage depending on your available resources. So if you have 100%, let's just say energy, it's going to give you the full 15% damage increase buff, which oftentimes you will have with this build. Now, I realized I didn't talk too much about defenses, and that's because honestly early on and with this build that moves all over the place, I never found the reason to even include them too much. Maybe past level 50, yes. But if you still want them, then I recommend going right away for the aspect of the Disobedience from the halls of the damned in Kyrgyzstan. And this triggers an armor increase on all forms of damage, up to 40% depending on the gear piece that you place it on. So this is going to have an almost 100% uptime. For the remaining gear pieces, it's a matter of preference and a bit of luck depending what other legendaries drop for you. So you can totally go for more offenses, defenses, or resource generation depending how you want to make it. But yeah, this is pretty much it with the build. Totally let me know down below if you're playing with a rogue right now or if you're planning to main it. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching and I'll see you guys in the next video.